Bob Schreiner. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers, and we've had some great ones the last 2 days, and I think that at least this one is going to continue that tradition. Lane Brunner works for the ANA. He is, I have to read this, it's a long title. He's the Deputy Executive Director for Museum, Library, and Research Services. He started his career, I know, as an academic in, I believe, pharmacology in Texas.
Pharmacy, yes.
Pharmacy in Texas, and followed his true love, numismatics, to the ANA, where he is now. He has a most intriguing topic for us, and I'll let him say more about that. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate it very much. My name is Lane Brunner, and I am on staff of the American Numismatic Association. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is really a story about the Wizard of Oz and how it relates to the rise of populism, or the bimetal standard of the late 1900s, early 20th century. Whenever you're ready?
Yep.
Great. So what we'd like to do is sort of go through a bit of a roadmap of how this story developed and really go through the actual story of the Wizard of Oz itself. First, we'll start out a little bit with the economic landscape and how that really lays the foundation for the rise of the populist movement. We'll talk a little bit about Frank Baum, who is the author of the Wizard of Oz series of books, and then how this allegory got launched with respect to the rise of populism and the story of the Wizard of Oz. Then we'll go through the actual story and then talk a little bit about the election of 1896, which is a really neat numismatic connection to this whole story. So when we look at the economic stage, what we're seeing is that the key factor in all of this was deflation. We're all used to dealing with inflation, but at this time, deflation was a real concern. The money stock was growing slower than the national output. In other words, the nation was growing, but there wasn't the money there to support it. And there was slow growth in what's referred to as high-powered money. That's gold, silver, as well as treasury obligations. Now, there was also rising unemployment. And in the 1890s, there was this beginning of this economic compression. All of this is leading to this whole movement. And what this was the result of is money became very expensive for farmers, because farming was the primary industry, but it became very expensive for farmers to borrow money to raise their crops. Then in 1893, we had what was known as the Panic of 1893. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act limited the coining of silver, and there were fears throughout the populace that the U.S. would leave the gold standard. We were, in fact, just a de facto gold standard by this time. And anytime you tell someone that we're going to be getting rid of something, everybody wants it. So there were fears that there would be a huge depletion of the treasury gold supplies, as there would be a rush for everyone to get gold coins. This was part of the reason there was a stock market crash, and with that there was a huge number of business and bank failures. But there were some solutions to this, some very easy solutions. One was to increase the money supply. And you could do that quite easily by printing more paper money. You're increasing the money supply by adding greenbacks or paper money to the money supply. That will help stop this deflation. Also, you could add another kind of money to the money supply, and that money is silver. We were already using gold, and we were already using greenbacks. Silver was not being used very much, so the idea of creating a bimetallic standard, so we had legal gold and legal silver we could use. And what I mean by that is that we could pay our taxes with gold or silver, as well as the greenbacks. However, it would lead to this inflationary idea, that it would eventually cause an inflation, and there isn't really a politician I can imagine who is alive who'd say, I would love to vote for inflation. And because of this, people were really fearful of not only printing more greenbacks, but also adding silver to the money supply. In order to really understand this, what we need to do is really concentrate on the quantity theory of money. Just kidding. If we're looking at the rise of populism, which really fuels all of this, we can look at farming was the top industry in our nation. We were a nation of farmers. We didn't really have an industrial revolution yet, but really farming was where a lot of our production was coming from. And this is around 1870, because the population was also primarily rural. About 20 years later, there was a huge increase in urban growth. So around 1890, people were leaving the farms and moving to the urban centers. The farmers at this time wanted and needed federal economic aid. Kind of sounds familiar. Farmers have always needed economic aid to help grow the crops that feed our nation. What they decided to do, though, is to use the power of a ballot box to be able to use their votes to change the laws. Rather than lobbying, they wanted to get the right people in office. And what they did is they decided they needed somewhere to hang their hats, and they hung it on free silver. And what I mean by free silver is the free coining of silver by the U.S. Mint for people to use in commerce, because this wasn't occurring at the time. So we think about this, right around this time we can look at gold, silver, and then this story comes out about the Wizard of Oz. And the person who wrote this is Frank Baum. He was born in a small city in New York. He loved the theater, wrote, produced, and acted in plays. And he decided to move out to enjoy the frontier life. He moved out to South Dakota. This was also a place where populism was starting to grow. Populism came more in the Midwest, but populism was beginning to grow. He edited a weekly newspaper, so he's already getting sort of involved with this current events and the populism movement. Later, he moved to a real political hotbed, and that's in Chicago. But one of the interesting things about him, if you read his biographies or interviews of his descendants, nobody really knows how politically active he was, and nobody really knows what his political slants were. He kept this very close to his vest. I think part of this is the reason why there's so much discussion about whether or not the book is an allegory towards anything at all or just a kid's story. And we know him, of course, for The Wizard of Oz. And this is one of the original covers on The Wizard of Oz. Really neat illustrations by Denslow, and you'll see those all throughout the presentation. So how did this allegory start? Well, The Wizard of Oz was published in 1900. And a number of years later, there was a teacher, Henry Littlefield, who was reading the story of The Wizard of Oz to his daughters. At the same time, he was teaching his students about the rise of the populist movement. And he started noticing these coincidences between the characters in The Wizard of Oz and the characters associated with the rise in the populist movement. And he wrote a paper back in about 1963-64 where he really started to bring these things out. No one else had looked at this before. Since then, there's been a number of people that have really expanded on this, and there's some great work that's been done by a number of economists who have looked at this from an economist perspective, as well as just sort of a fantasy perspective. Of course, most of us know The Wizard of Oz through the movie. And here are the characters. You see Judy Garland there. And we're familiar with this whole idea of, and there's Toto up there, the Yellow Brick Road, and all of these characters and their wonderful trek through the movie. One of the interesting things I like about this book, and another neat thing about this book is you can get this book online. It is public domain. So you can read this story as well, and you don't have to go out and find an original version of the book. Is the quotation he has in the introduction, and that is, this story was written solely to pleasure children of today. That's an interesting statement to write in a book dedicated to entertain children. Why would you need to say that, essentially, if you have a cover that looks like this? So you think, would this be a kid's story, or is this a satire on the populist movement? So he sort of leads you into this idea that there's something he's protesting. He's anticipating that you're going to think about this. And the following year, in his book American Fairy Tales, there's another passage. The stories are not serious in purpose, but aim to amuse and entertain, yet I trust the more thoughtful readers will find something else in them. And in my mind, I look at this as perhaps that's a clue. He's talking about some of the books he's writing. In fact, later on, he wrote another edition in the Oz series that really was a satire or allegory of the suffragette movement. And he acknowledged that because he was a great supporter of that. So it's reasonable to assume that with the Wizard of Oz, there was something else there as well. And here is another, this is a broadside or a poster of the book advertising that. And so now we can start in our story. And what we'll do is I'll introduce the various characters throughout this and how they make their way through the story. I won't go through every detail of the story, but really where the allegory sort of hits. And then we have our first character is Dorothy. And Dorothy represents really what is referred to it as Miss Everyman. It is the girl next door. She's kind. She's honest. She really represents a young, vibrant America. This is when we look back at America at this time, we think it is a very young, a growing, honest country. So Dorothy really represents this idealized America. Kansas is another character. Characters aren't only individuals, but they're also things in this story. Kansas was a character that was described as gray and lifeless. It was a populist stronghold. This is really where the movement began. Kansas farmers in editorials were singled out as being particularly stupid. Very, very vicious attacks on Kansas farmers. They're too dumb to comprehend everything that's going on, or anything that's going on. Some really particularly vicious attacks to them. One of the early titles of the story, instead of Wizard of Oz, interestingly enough, was called From Kansas to Fairyland. Again, the populist movement started really in Kansas and expanded from there. And the interesting thing about Baum's writing, Baum was not a fantastic writer. He wrote good kids' stories. But some of his best writing is actually in the first chapter of Wizard of Oz and how he describes Kansas. It's very vivid in how he describes it as being this gray, lifeless, despair-filled area. The next character is the Cyclone. And the Cyclone represents the free silver movement. This is also, that movement's also been referred to as a political tornado. And this is also at the time we had the Depression of 1893. And what you will see with a lot of the cartoons of the era is that that depression is referred to as a financial storm. So there is this theme of tornadoes, storms, cyclones. And of course here we see the house being lifted up and Dorothy grabbing what is apparently a very uncomfortable Toto and trying to drag Toto along. A next character we meet or we hear about is the Wicked Witch of the East. And the Wicked Witch of the East really represents the Eastern banking and financial interests. And if at any time you think of Eastern banking at this point, you're thinking of Wall Street. They really are the Wicked Witch of the East. And because the Wicked Witch of the East in the story enslaved the Munchkins. And we'll get to the Munchkins in a few moments. But now if you're a populist, you would have thought that the Wicked Witch was someone else, the Eastern Witch. And that would be Grover Cleveland. He led the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Politically, he was dead. And the Wicked Witch of the East, at the beginning of the story, was dead. And he controlled the Munchkins as well. Now, who are these Munchkins? The Munchkins were the common people of the East, the everyday folks. They were financially enslaved to the Wicked Witch. So that could be Grover Cleveland for the economy that we have at the time, or it could be Wall Street. And they never really understood the power that they had, which is a theme throughout the story. The common people did not understand the power they had, generally through the ballot box, and how to use that. The next character is the Shoes. Now, in the story, do any of you remember what color the shoes are, or what the shoes are made out of? Well, rubies, that's, in the book, they're actually made out of silver. And because the reason they were made out of ruby, or they're portrayed as being rubies in the movie, is because the ruby slippers, the movie was in Technicolor, looked better dancing across the yellow brick road than silver would. But in the original story, they were silver. And they are really the key to the entire story. because they represented the silver portion of the bimetallic standard. The Eastern witch who knew the power and controlled the silver shoes, really represented those who controlled the supply of silver, that additional money that could be added to the economy. Then we have the Good Witch of the North. The Good Witch in the North were the Northern voters. The Northern voters were pro-silver or pro-democratic. So they really were the ones that the populists needed to get support behind in order to have their candidates elected. And in the story, the Northern witch kissed Dorothy to protect her. The Northern voters would protect the country by voting for the populist candidates. Then our next character is the Yellow Brick Road. The Yellow Brick Road is the gold standard, gold part of the bimetallic standard. It leads to the political center in the land of Oz. Oz is also an abbreviation for ounce, in this case, ounce of gold. When Frank Baum was originally asked how did he come up with the name Oz, what he had said was, I believe on a filing cabinet, that on the very bottom, the last drawer was O to Z, and that's how he came up with Oz. So that's how he sort of diffused this part of the argument, but it also is convenient that OZ is an abbreviation for ounce. And of course, everything leads to the Emerald City. The Emerald City is Washington, D.C. It is the political center. The color emerald represents greenbacks. So now we have three forms of money introduced into this story. We have gold, we have silver, and we have greenbacks. Of course, we can't forget Toto. Toto looks a little mad in this picture. Toto, what was written, is that he trotted soberly behind Dorothy. It's really a pun on the teetotalers. The teetotalers were this group of prohibitionists that supported the populists, but they really never made a great impact. They're kind of like that little yappy dog that's just always there and annoying, but really never does much. And that's why I think it's hysterical that Toto was used as that symbol. And that Frank Baum wrote something as clever as Toto trotting soberly behind Dorothy. Now, we're going to go out and meet these folks as we go into the land of Oz. And first character we meet is the Scarecrow. The Scarecrow was the American farmer. And if you remember, he had no brains. Now, the Kansas farmers were really attacked in editorials about being stupid and not having the understanding of any type of complex issues, especially when it comes to monetary theory. But they are an absolute key role in this entire movement because they're the ones that are starting this populist movement. And that's why the Scarecrow is the first one that Dorothy, who represents America, meets along the way. But the Yellow Brick Road isn't perfect. It is patchy. And the Scarecrow, who is the farmer, fell along the way, could not transverse this patchy yellow brick road. And what it represented was the danger to the farmers of using only gold as the standard. Because if you have only the yellow brick road, only gold, the farmers couldn't transverse that. They would fall along the way. Dorothy, however, walked around these patches in her silver shoes. The idea that if you use gold and silver together, you can transverse this path. The next character they meet is the Tin Woodman, and he represents the industrial worker. And it is really an interesting commentary at this point. This is the beginning of the urbanization. People are moving out and becoming industrial workers in urban sites, and so it was a dehumanizing of the American farmer is one way to look at it. And he goes from, based on his story, from human to tin. He is turned into a tin man. And he is rusted from years of idleness. Well, there was a huge amount of unemployment. Well, he was unemployed, so he was rusted. He did not have anywhere to work. He couldn't be useful, so he rusted. However, he was rescued with oil, which can be thought of as a monetary lubricant. So you add money to the monetary supply, like silver, and you can rescue the urban worker. Next, we have the Cowardly Lion, almost everyone's favorite character in this. The Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan. He was the populist candidate who won the Democratic nomination, came out of nowhere to win this. I mean, he gave probably one of the most impassioned and important political speeches of his life, if not all time in Western civilization, known as the Cross of Gold speech. And you can also get this online. Most of it is okay. If you understand the politics of the time, it's a very interesting talk, a very interesting speech. But he was a very fairly well unknown candidate until this, and he came out of nowhere to win the Democratic nomination. He's probably most famous for his theme of being the great commoner, and his closing line of, "You shall now press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And when he said that, everyone in Chicago exploded. They just went crazy. This is fire and brimstone, old-time political stumping. He knew how to run a crowd. It had nothing to do with television, nothing to do with it. He knew how to get a crowd going. But why cowardly? Because if he's this great orator, if he's this roaring lion that he was, why was he cowardly? That really comes from his stance on anti-imperialism. See, the populists wanted free silver. We want you to do nothing but talk about free silver. Anything else is a diversion. Free silver was a difficult position to sell. So it was felt by the populists that he was becoming cowardly because he was diverting to anti-imperialism. Another very important issue at the time, but the populists wanted free silver. They wanted a bimetallic standard. So they accused him, his own folks accused him of being cowardly anytime he would talk about anti-imperialism. So when the Cowardly Lion is met, his clause could make no impression on the Tin Woodman. This is really a reflection that Bryan failed to get support from the urban voters. He could not make an impression on them. He could not get them to join his side of the argument. So his clause could make no impression. So this is Dorothy's party. We have the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and the Cowardly Lion, and then they're off on their adventure. This is kind of like Coxey's army, and this was a group of sort of ragtag folks, of unemployed people who marched on Washington, and Jacob Coxey was a person who supported greenbacks. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to help diffuse this deflation by adding more money to the monetary supply, but he was a greenbacker. He wanted the government to print more money and provide jobs through government works to infuse more money into the economy. Basically, the same thing that the populists wanted to do with silver, just using that other form of money at the time. Very good idea, probably would have worked. He wanted to get 5,000 people to march on Washington. About 500 went, and it sort of became not taken very seriously when he got there. But it sort of is like Dorothy's band of folks that are going to the Emerald City. Along the way, they meet the Kalidas, which are these lion-headed bears, these very interesting characters that were representing newspaper reporters, because the Kalidas were very hostile. Well, the newspaper reporters were very hostile towards Bryan. They didn't like him at all. It didn't help that Bryan often referred to them as predatory animals, so they would tend to get back at him a little bit. But here's an example of some of the more gentle political commentary that's been out there. And here what we have is the grand old party, the Republicans, and here's the elephant testing this water that's free silver, and it's referred to as the Populist Trap. So the Republicans are smart enough not to step into this trap, but here the Democrats, who the populists are trying to get to support them, and by this time Bryan had already had the nomination, the populists fall into this free silver trap. So how smart the elephant is, how foolish the Democrats are. Here's another one that's somewhat more vicious. It's called the Sacrilegious Candidate. And this is really making fun of Bryan's Cross of Gold speech. Here you have William Jennings Bryan carrying this cross of gold, trampling across a map of the United States, waving this crown of thorns. Some of these cartoons were just absolutely vicious. And at the time, they're just very strong political commentary. Along their way, they enter the deadly poppy field. And this is sort of a out of story part that comes up that is somewhat confusing unless you think about really what's going on at the time. Here, the lion falls asleep but is pulled to safety. Bryan is falling asleep and then he's saved. Because what was happening was Bryan was beginning to spend much more attention on anti-imperialism rather than free silver. Because Bryan, being a reasonably smart politician, was realizing that free silver was not going to win the election. So we need to talk about something else that's very popular, and that's anti-imperialism. But the populists felt that he was falling asleep, he was going to die in this issue, die in this poppy field, unless they could save him. And the field mice came to his rescue. And the field mice represented the little people concerned with ordinary things. The rank and file populace, you and I, the voters. And without the rank and file populace, Bryan would never be elected. So their support was crucial. So this is sort of Baum's way of saying they had to rescue him from this anti-imperialism in order for him to be able to win his election. And one of the other characters is the Stork. And the Stork is a female stork that carries the Scarecrow across the river. The populists were supported by those who supported the suffragette movement. In fact, the populists were the ones who had positions in Congress that really led the charge for women's voting. So this female stork represents the suffragette movement, helping support these characters on their way to visit the Wizard of Oz. Frank Baum's mother, Matilda Gage, was very strong in the suffragette movement. So he had this connection. And remember, later on, a few years later, he writes another book in the Oz series that is an allegory of the suffragette movement. So he was very, very passionate about this. And then we get to the Emerald City. And here's the gatekeeper of the Emerald City, rather charming looking character. And in order to get into the Emerald City, everybody, including Toto, had to wear green tinted glasses. To get into the Emerald City, you had to wear green colored glasses so that everything you saw was green. Everything you saw represented greenbacks. And so while they're waiting to see the Great Oz, they're told, Oz can take any form he wishes. He can appear any way he likes. Oz has a great pot of courage covered by a golden plate. At the gate, Dorothy, in order to get in, rings the bell and hears a silvery tinkle, using Baum's words. So here is another reference to gold and to silver. In fact, what's interesting about this book, if you can get this book electronically, do a search for every time the word gold or silver appears. And you'll see it is throughout the book. So they're still waiting to see Oz, and then Dorothy's led through 7 passages and up 3 flights of stairs. This is a reference back to the crime of 1873. And this is turned out to be a very controversial decision that Congress made to eliminate the silver dollar. It's referred to as a crime because it was reported later on that no one had a discussion about this. This flew under the radar. No one knew about this, and we really didn't vote on this. If you look back at the congressional record, it was discussed for hours. And it is in the congressional record. Nobody at the time really understood, I believe, the implication years later of removing the silver dollar and replacing it with the trade dollar. This effectively demonetized silver and put us on a de facto gold standard. Of course, if you owned a silver mine, you really weren't happy about this. So when Dorothy appears, Oz is a giant head. It's, I am Oz the Great and Terrible. Where'd you get those shoes? Oz already understood the power of the silver shoes, understood the power of the silver supply and how to manage that, and wanted to know, where did you find the power in the silver shoes? Dorothy asks of him, I just want to be able to go home. And he asks, of course, why should I do this for you? Then we have the Scarecrow meets Oz. I am Oz the Great and Terrible. I need some brains. Scarecrow asks him for something. Oz asks back, why should I do this for you? And now we have the Tin Man. Tin Man sees Oz as a terrible beast. I am Oz the Great and Terrible. Will you please give me a heart? Why should I do this for you? Oz always returns with that question. And then the Lion sees him as this great ball of fire. Again, I'm Oz the Great and Terrible. I need some courage. Why should I do this for you? So Oz is not granting wishes. But what you get are consistent messages that are coming from the wizard. I am great and I am terrible. In this country, everyone must pay for everything he gets. Kill the Wicked Witch of the West and you'll get your wish. Quid pro quo. This is a wonderful illustration of a politician. I can be good, I can be bad. If you want something from me, you have to give me something first. And Baum did not like politicians, and it comes out in this story. Later on, in 1908, he writes another book where Oz's full name comes out. And if you look at all of the beginning letters of this, what you'll see is he refers to Oz as a politician, but also Oz as a pinhead. So really a slam against politicians, in particular, Great Oz himself is just really a pinhead. And if you were part of the populist movement, you thought of the Wizard of Oz, one person came to mind, and that was Marcus Hanna. Hanna was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and it was felt that he really was the brains behind McKinley. He was the one pulling all the strings. He was a strategist. He knew everything that was going on. He understood, as Oz, the power of the silver shoes. He understood what it meant to add silver back into the economy. And the Wicked Witch of the West was William McKinley. And he had a golden cap that controlled the winged monkeys. He also wanted to possess the silver shoes because McKinley wasn't against bimetallism. He was for bimetallism, but only on an international basis. But the European nations were on a gold standard. They didn't want a bimetallic standard. He knew that, so he could say all he wanted, that we would have a bimetallic standard as long as it was international, knowing fully well it would never occur. And also he controlled the yellow Winkies, and we'll get to them in a moment. The yellow Winkies really is a not-so-polite reference to the Philippine Islands. And the yellow Winkies were enslaved by the Western Witch. And this is really an allusion to, again, anti-imperialism, but McKinley's decision to deny the Philippines independence. And this is when we were going in and sort of our imperialistic ways, but we would deny the Philippines their independence. So therefore, the Wicked Witch controlled the yellow Winkies. Now we have the winged monkeys. You really got to like a story with flying monkeys. These were really not a popular part of the allegory, but Littlefield, who originally developed this, liked these guys as the Plains Indians. And I kind of like his analysis. And what's written is that once we were free people living happily in a great forest, the Plains Indians at one time were free. We kind of ruined that for them. They understood the destructive power of the golden cap, and they knew they couldn't avoid the power of the gold standard. They knew they couldn't avoid the power of gold because what was happening at this time, people were going west to strike gold, to find gold. And so they knew that there was something going on, that they were going to have to succumb to the power of the gold cap. Well, then Dorothy kills the Western witch. The witch tries to get one of her shoes and does successfully get one of her shoes from her. Dorothy gets so mad that she pours water on the witch, and of course the very famous scene in the movie of the witch melting. But what's interesting is something as simple as water stopped this. And it's sort of an allusion to what could have helped with the farmers is there's a tremendous drought going on at this time. And something as simple as water could have saved a lot of their problems. Now, Dorothy commands the golden cap. But if you look back here, she's only got one shoe. There's the other one. But Dorothy eventually rescues her party. The Tin Woodman gets a new axe handle that's gold with a blade polished like silver. Gold and silver. The Tin Woodman gets a silver oil can with gold inlay. Gold and silver. Toto and the Lion get a gold collar. And to me, that is the neatest part of this entire story. How he cleverly adds in Toto and the Lion get only a gold collar, indicating that gold alone could strangle anyone that it attaches itself to. Again, more flying monkeys. You got to like these guys. So they go back to Oz, realize that Oz is really a fake or a humbug, and that the wizard has been lying. Imagine the odds. A politician has lied to you. The Scarecrow, Tin Woodman, and Lion get their wishes, which is really kind of interesting because Dorothy's wish is the only one that's pure. She doesn't want anything but just to go home. Dorothy, America, just wants to go back to where it was, just back to being safe and back to Kansas. What she gets is the promise of a hot air balloon ride to Kansas. She gets a promise of hot air from a politician. Along the way, and this is sort of where the story strays, but if you understand Baum's way of thinking, it kind of is interesting. They go to the dainty China country. You must crawl over this high wall to enter this China country. The damage to these dainty figurines only occurs by foreign invaders. They live fine together on their own. Any foreign invader comes in, they're the ones that cause damage. And this was the populist stance of anti-imperialism. We don't need to go into China because all we will do is destroy their culture. Then we meet the Good Witch of the South. And the South is ruled by a good witch. North is ruled by a good witch. North and South are good. East and West are bad. The South was sympathetic to the silver issue, so it was really not surprising at all that the South had a good witch. Your silver shoes will carry you over the great desert. To get over this horrific thing, you'll need your silver shoes. This was the populist dream of political power, but only with Southern help. That with the South and with the North, the populists can win against those who only wanted the gold standard. And there's no place like home. There's no place like home. Knock 3 times and your silver shoes will take you. Indicating that America always understood the power of the silver shoes. It was right before them. All America had to do was knock their shoes together 3 times to really release the power of silver. And that was just adding silver to the money supply. Along the way, though, her silver shoes disappear. They get lost. And that's really looking back at later on, 4 years later. We're thinking of the election of 1896. 4 years later, the silver issue was gone. It really was a dead issue. They lost the silver shoes along the way. So, if you look at this, is it an allegory of the populist movement or a kid's tale? Well, it can be either one. I happen to think it's fun as an allegory of the populist movement and the bimetallic standard, but it can also be a kid's story. And then there's a neat numismatic connection to this, and it's a very popular area to collect, even if it's not numismatic, is the election of 1896, because It is really old-fashioned politics at its finest and at its meanest and most public. Here's an example of a broadside for the Democrats, and here we see the Democratic candidate and his family, so William Jennings Bryan and his family, his famous Cross of Gold speech that was everywhere he went. Cross of Gold, and 16-1 across here. What you see is a very patriotic theme, a very family-oriented theme. One could say a very just relaxed, easy theme. And now we get to the Republicans. Another very patriotic theme, but much more stern. Here you have both candidates, none of their family at all. Very hard edges to this. You have every possible industry, our home defenders. The Republicans are trying to be everything for everybody. So definite contrast into how these two campaigns were run. Here we see some of the more interesting political cartoons. Here we have what's a cartoon about Bryan, and there are some tokens that were released with these similar themes. And at the top it says, "In God we trust, for the other 47 cents." And this was an allusion to Bryan's idea of adding silver to the monetary standard really would cut the value of the silver dollar by about 53%. 47%. So it really cuts it in about half. And so the political cartoonists love this part of it. And here we have one that's pro-Bryan leading different versions of America or liberty through the field of free silver. Here we have one that is anti-Bryan, that is Bryan trying to place on a worker this crown of thorns, but it's actually a silver dollar, trying to force this on labor. And of course, labor doesn't want to have this, doesn't want to increase the monetary supply. Here we have one that's also pretty violent if you think about it. Here we have Uncle Sam, which represents America, and silver and gold. If America stays with both of those, it'll rip them in half. And here we have those who support the silver standard flying to this moths, or as moths, flying to this flame, and the closer and closer they get to supporting free silver, the more rapid they die. And here is Bland, by the way, who is the true supporter of the Morgan dollar. It was really originally referred to as the Bland dollar when it came out. So he's getting pretty close. And here we have one that's called a mighty risky experiment. And here we have labor and Bryan as this fool that is going to double the money supply, but potentially cut the head off labor by doing it. And here we have one where it makes fun of Bryan going around the country in the back of a train and spouting out or blowing all this hot air about his position of 16-1. And there's some really interesting things. It's very difficult to see on here, but it talks how education really is not appropriate. I mean, it's just some very, very interesting things that people are claiming that he's saying. And here we have Hannah, who is, through coercion, putting this crown of thorns on a worker, and Bryan, who's in back, going to stop this and prevent this from happening to the rest of America. And in 1900, Bryan, of course, didn't win in 1896, but ran again in 1900. And what he's trying to do is trying to paint out the old sign. Had free silver before, now free silver is no longer an issue. Remember, the shoes are gone. They fell off along the way. Now it's anti-imperialism.
Question?
Yes?
And I might have missed it, and I apologize. It looks like there's an ostrich in the background. What was the purpose of that on the sign? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know what that was about. I haven't been able to figure that out. It's an interesting observation. And there are some really neat collectibles. commonly referred to as Bryan money. Some of them are really money, some of them are different. This is a gold bug. It actually has 16 to 1 on here, so my guess is this probably at one time was just silver and was gilded for whatever reason. But this is a little stick pin, and you could buy this outside of where the people were campaigning. This is what's known as a comparator token. This is often referred to as Bryan, the true Bryan. This is also known as a so-called dollar. And what it is, it was produced, this one is produced by Gorham. Tiffany also produced these as well. And it's to give an idea of a comparison to what a silver dollar is you have in your hand and what $1 worth of silver really is. The idea that this is a silver dollar that you can use right now, use in commerce. But a dollar's worth of silver really is this much silver, indicating that you're being cheated out of a lot of the silver really that's in a dollar. Here it says 412.5 grains of coin silver, which is 900 fine. This piece contains 823 grains. The idea that it's about twice, you're only getting about half the silver that you really should be getting for that dollar.
Do you know who sponsored those? Because they wouldn't have given that away.
No, these weren't given away.
Who did they appeal to?
Well, you would purchase these. Whether you could get these directly from the campaign or not, I'm not sure. But you could buy these, and these were for people who would support Bryan or support the silver movement. Because there are none of these like that I know of like this that were anti-Bryan. There's some, but not of this quality.
The other thing I noticed too is that the reverse has a cartwheel on it. And of course, silver dollars were often called cartwheels.
Yes, referred to as cartwheel. Yes, absolutely. Here we have satirical tokens, and this is my absolute favorite. This is one that says, "The United Snakes of America, in Bryan we trust," where the populist movement is represented as a donkey on the body of a duck. On the back it says, "Free silver, 1896, and you could give one damn." And this is really some of the more fun ones that you can collect of the Bryan money or the Bryan tokens. Absolutely hysterical. And there's a whole bunch of... I'm sorry?
Damn is a coin denomination in the country of India.
I guess I never thought about it like that. It's a coin denomination in India. I never thought about if there would be a connection that way. That's interesting.
Yeah, because that's already from the Greek term drum.
Right. Mm-hmm.
There's also an animal called a dam, and I'm not sure what animal that is. I believe that's a reference to some kind of an animal too. So I wonder if that has any relationship to what's shown.
It certainly could.
Because it's obviously at DAMN, although they may not have
Right.
get away with that. Using that word, I don't know.
Right, and that I don't know. So it could be both ways. I mean, you could look at it as being either an animal or reference to another denomination, but also reference to a different spelling. And there's a whole lot of different 1896 stuff that you can collect. There's absolutely an amazing collection of them out there. Any other questions at all?
Why did the silver issue fall away?
The silver issue fell away primarily because a candidate knew they couldn't get elected by using that as the primary movement. Bryan still did support free silver, and there still was support for it. It just was not an issue that he ever really talked about that much, because it wasn't something that was going to get him elected any of the 3 times he ran.
Why would Baum have done this? First of all, very elaborate model or allegory. And why would he not admit to it? And he apparently did for the one he did later about, was it suffragette? Or
Yes, for the suffragette movement.
why would he not be more open about the reason or that the act?
I have
I don't know the answer.
I have no idea why he wouldn't admit to it. Perhaps he just wanted to keep that as a mystery. But even his descendants have said it's not a story about the populist movement.
Maybe he never spoke about it to his family even.
Or it really isn't, and this is just a fantasy. I mean, who knows? But it's a fun topic.
It is. Did that story become immediately popular?
Oh yes, absolutely.
So
As
maybe
a
he
kid's
didn't
story.
want to dilute the popularity of it. As a kid's story.
That could be.
So,
He never really discussed his motives, but he did state that it was not an allegory.
yeah.
He's come out and stated that, you know, when he was interviewed at the time, and his descendants have stuck with that. And it wasn't until the 1960s that this teacher came up with this connection, and then others, as well as economists, have really delved into this a little bit deeper and come up with this.
But he stated it wasn't an allegory, and he died in 1919, so someone must have thought it might have been before he died.
Or if it meant the story had some other meaning to it, and he had stated that it is a kid's story. That's all it is. And his descendants have since said that I think his son has come out in interviews and said, no, Dad's always said that it is just a story.
Excellent presentation. I'm really forgetting my role here. Any other questions? Pardon me, I got so wrapped up in that I forgot my duties here. But thank you for a great presentation. On behalf of the ANA, which you're of
Thank you very
course
much.
a member of, we have a certificate of appreciation. And very nicely done this year, I might say, for this presentation.
Thank you very much.